it's like, no, we just have to think about class differently. We have to conceive of migration differently, right? And we have to think about it in these sort of in these bigger terms, in these bigger frames. And even also, if we want any sort of revitalization, if we want any to think about a base and how we build a real a sort of a mass base, and if we're really interested in building sort of a radical mass-based working class movement, that actually means talking about race, right? That means talking about migration.
So, thank you so much for joining us today, Mustafa. I'm going to start off with just opening the floor to you and letting you introduce yourself.
So my name is Mustafa Hanawi, and I'm a community organizer at the Immigrant Worker Center, which is an organization that organizes non-unionized, precarious migrant and immigrant workers, both for workplace justice, but also around migrant justice as well. And also, I've been a writer, researcher, and been involved in other activist collectives and organizations, both here in Montreal and in Toronto.
Awesome. We'll just jump right into your book. Your book, Essential Work, Disposable Workers, is a crucial text that highlights pressing issues around migrant workers' rights and labor. Could you tell us a little bit about what inspired you to write the book, and what like your intention was?
So there was a few reasons about about writing the book, and I mean, it's funny because when the book project had started, it was during like Trump 1.0, and trying to saw it as really an intervention in the left, but trying to have a bit more of a structural or deeper analysis. At that same time, during Trump, sort of the murmurs around how we think about class, who do we conceive of, when we're thinking about class, and also some of the debates around identity politics or questions around race, to me, were sort of false debates, but unfortunately, we're seeing those debates actually happen again in a different form, because a lot of the language was, from certain sections of the left. Oh, what about the forgotten working class, right? Like everyone's just talking about migration and open borders. And, because this was a moment too, you had, when Trump had won in 2016, that, oh, we've been, and you had the Solidarity Summer in Europe, you had the refugee welcome movement in Canada, you had the migrant caravans coming from Central America, and you had some voices, mostly on the reformist left, sort of even parliamentary left, that were saying, well, this is all in fine. Everyone wants to talk about race and open borders, but what about the working class? And that's what's led to the far right rising power, because at that time, you did have Brexit, you had the first surges of the Alternative for Deutschland, and you had Trump, right? And a lot of this, there was this false debate in terms of understanding and analyzing why that took place. And so the intervention really of the book was to say, it's like, no, we just have to think about class differently. We have to conceive of migration differently, right? And we have to think about it in these bigger terms, in these bigger frames. And even also, if we want any sort of revitalization, if we want any to think about a base and how we build a real a sort of a mass base, and if we're really interested in building sort of a radical mass-based working class movement, that actually means talking about race, right? That means talking about migration. Those demands, because fundamentally, the role that migration plays within global capitalism is central. It's not marginal. And that was the other intervention that I was trying to play with the book, is that these things are really are central, right? Quite the opposite. They're not just simply identity politics on the side while the real working class struggle is taking place in factories and in manufacturing and but actually the struggles of migrants on farms for status and people doing care work or people doing Uber or people in Amazon. These are central elements to global capitalism, right? And luckily enough, the book wasn't finished during the pandemic. So the pandemic sort of also proved the book, or at least the idea, pretty right, because, during the pandemic, all of a sudden these people who were disposable, who were invisible, all of a sudden became essential, right? We had this moment, and it's gone already, that fleeting moment where, yes, we do stand with migrants, and migrant workers are fundamental. And migrant workers are fundamental not just to our economy, but to our society as a whole. And they're guardian angels and all of the language around it, right? Because when borders were closed for everyone, they were open for migrant workers, right? And so that also that comes into the book because the how long it took to write the book. And then the other intervention was really around, to try to say the struggles of migrant workers too aren't marginal, right? Like that they're organizing and that the way they've organized has tremendous lessons for the left more broadly, right? And, still to this day, the only political general strike in U.S. history was a day without an immigrant in 2006, on May 1st, 2006.
But this is in the U.S.
Yeah, this is in the U.S., right? We haven't, there's a lot of potentials, but, you had migrant strikes or sans-papiers strikes in Paris. You had the massive movements in Europe. A lot of the new militant unions that exist in Europe are all led by migrant workers, right? So there's this, they're actually showing us the path about how we need to organize more broadly, right? And also how do we include those struggles into thinking about a radical vision, but a radical vision about how we organize. So that intervention too it wasn't just about, okay, well, they're central, but it's not just about their agency, but the lesson that migrant worker organizing has for us in a broad, especially in this moment, when the prescription of the left was, and I think still is, and I think this is part of our crisis, is like, we need to radicalize the social democratic parties and the big unions, and we need a large radical socialist party or anti-capitalist organization that can direct those struggles. And to me, it's things like, actually, migrants are forging an entire new strategy in terms of an anti-capitalist left, right? And why aren't we really assessing that? And if you go back in history, I couldn't do that through a lot of those very radical moments that we look to. Migrant and immigrant workers have been central to it, especially when you're thinking about class struggle politics, right? So even if you think about the hot autumn in Italy, that was internal migration, right? At the beginnings of the autonomous movement, the Fiat strikes in Turin and Genova. So you have all of these moments that sort of push. So, I mean, the book is also really about struggle as well and finding new forms of organizing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Just to stay on the topic of unions, like, what do you think about sort of like that dichotomy between like almost like the whitewashing of like the worker and like kind of almost like the removal of immigrant workers and temp workers that often are like racialized people, and how people kind of talk about the union that almost like erases their involvement? But what do you think about like sort of the decline in sort of unions like interjecting themselves in the context of like migrant workers and how they play a central role? Because that's not how because I've fallen into that trap of kind of just thinking, almost don't want to play into the idea of like identity politics, IDPOL, and sort of like the way that liberals kind of talk about immigrants in this kind of like bleeding heart way, but then they still maintain the aspects of capitalism that exploit those people. So like, what do you think about, I don't know if that question made sense, but
Yeah, no, it definitely makes sense, right? I mean, it's not only whitewashing, but like again, like part of the book was like, what power do migrants actually have, right? Like the power that they have collectively is economic, right? It's not political. It's economic, right? But the idea, and I think there's a structural thing about unions, right? Like unions are collective defense organizations, right? So unions are always going to be concerned primarily about their members, right? They don't have an expansive ideology about class anymore, right? They don't have an expansive ideology about defending all workers, right? Their main concern is defending their members. And then that begins to shrink, especially throughout the 90s, right? Because what do you have? You have deindustrialization. You have the relocation of work. You have the major inclusion of women into the capitalist workforce. You have major waves of migration. And then what you have is the rise of, precarious work, right? Especially throughout the 90s. Everything they couldn't offshore to maquiladoras or to export processing zones, they made the same conditions here, right? So impossible to unionize, low wage, racialized labor for all the sectors of the economy that they can't actually ship away, right? You can't ship away a farm. You can't ship away care work. You can't ship away food processing. You can't ship away logistics, right? So all of those things, they have to make them precarious, right? And then you have to use cheap migrant labor in order to do that. And so, but what unions couldn't really grapple with that change, right? And so instead the unions, so in more and more there became this distance of who's actually inside the unions and who's not in the unions, who the unions wish to prioritize to organize. And you see this all the time, that it's too difficult or there's too many challenges or there's, so more and more they become more defensive in their nature. And then they have to deal with this crisis, right? That, even in Quebec, right? We think about like, we believe that there's this very strong labor movement, right? But if you take away the public sector, union density is below 20% in the private sector. That's not very far off from the United States, right? So as this mass labor movement that represents the working class, it actually represents a minority within the working class and a ever increasingly smaller minority of workers, right? But we have this because of their size, well, that represents the mass of working people. It actually doesn't, right? They actually fall outside of of unions. But I think the big unions, they're also, because of that, there becomes very deep cultural questions, right? Where like, how do you actually how do you change the culture of the unions? How do they become more representative of the new realities of work? And I think they're still doing it in a way that's done out of charity, right? And I think they're doing it in a way that's like, even when they see it through this lens of like, well, it's these marginal group of workers, this isn't going to transform our union, and this is going to be a transformative process, and we're going to have this radicalized union. No, they still see it as this like very, almost as like a radical charity. We're in solidarity with migrant workers, or in the worst case scenarios, it's all about integration, right? Like if you want to talk about in Quebec, it's not about organizing migrant workers, but it's about franchisation. Like people are being paid below minimum wage. Who cares what language they're speaking? They don't even get to talk. They're like isolated, picking strawberries on their knees for 14 hours, and you're talking about integration? Like, even the whole language, no one wants to integrate them, right? So they're structurally excluded, right? They're here on temporary work visas. They're here as guest workers or undocumented. They're actually structurally excluded. So what are you talking about integration? And they understand that no one's trying to integrate them, right? So I think the politics around, and this is like, it's not just a Quebec issue. This is quite global, right? And that's why you see a lot of migrant workers forming new unions. That's not the case here per se, but especially in Europe, they're forming their own unions. Even if they're more like, let's say, class-based and they're not explicitly migrant unions, they're predominantly, their members are migrant unions or migrant members. So I think, to me, always grapple. Can the unions change? Can you transform the big unions? Can you drag them to this position where they're willing to open up to new ideas and new methods of organizing and new ways of organizing all of these members? I don't know, because there's such a structural logic, right? That goes beyond questions of race, right? That goes beyond questions of gender, but just in terms of how work is transformed and the legality of things, So no one wants to organize people who work in temporary placement agencies, right? Because who's the employer? No one wants to organize Uber Eats drivers. No one wants to organize care workers. Nobody wants to do that because it's just too challenging and it'll be too costly. Because the way unions have come to manage conflict is through the courts. So everything's always balanced in terms of like, how much will this cost in terms of legal fees? Not like, oh, this is really important. Because if we organize this one migrant community, or migrants are really engaged, we're going to really build a new base of workers, and that's going to really rebuild our union. They're not, no one's strategically thinking in those terms.
Yeah. Kind of, you touched on sort of the aspect of like integration and like integrated, like the act of like people being in this country working and then just never being integrated into the society. You mentioned a phrase, globalizing the kafala system. Mm-hmm. Can you sort of go into detail like what the kafala system is, and how that is being implicated into Canadian Quebec society?
So the kafala system, there's so the kafala system is essentially, kafil means sponsor, right? So it comes out of the British Empire, right? And British Raj. And the kafil system is the system of private sponsorship, right? So which has become the model in the Arab Gulf country, the Gulf Corporation countries, right? So the GCC. So all the oil producing countries in the Arab Gulf predominantly rely on migrant labor, right? Their actual populations are quite tiny, right? Most of the people who live there are migrant workers, right? And there's a general notion of the kafala system as being bad, right? That, you look at the World Cup in Qatar and people talk about human rights abuses and how people don't have open work permits. And most of the people work on these closed work permits that can be pulled away. You've had wildcat strikes of Nepalese workers, of Bangladeshi workers. And, it's led to extreme violence, people not being paid, people having no rights, because of this employer-driven migration system. And what's really globalized, and no one's saying, what they're doing in Qatar or in Saudi Arabia is a really great model. But most of the advanced capitalist countries look at Canada and say that's the model. And Canada's model of neoliberal migration is exactly the same model as the kafala system, right? And I mean, it even has a longer durée, right? Because it really is modeled, as a British colony. It was the British Empire that actually introduced the kafala system, named different things in other parts of the British Empire. So indentured labor or the coolie labor system, where it was contract labor, employer driven, without. Even then, it might have even been better because citizenship was a possibility because you were a citizen of the empire, right? So even if you came from the colony, you were part of the empire, right? So even now it's worse because you're no longer part of the empire, right? You're and so Canada's system of temporary migration that's employer driven is it's pinned by the exact same logic of the kafala system, right? So we had this major transformation after the tar sands expansion in Alberta in 2006, where we moved away from permanent migration as a source of labor to temporary migration under what was called the Low Skilled Pilot Project, right? So, and early on, it was quite expensive. 1 out of 3 jobs being created were out of the temporary foreign worker program. And then now we have almost double the amount of people who come as temporary migrants as they do as permanent, right? And this is actually the model that's being seen as a way to manage. And they always use this term, right? In the mainstream media and in sort of this capitalist discourse, it's about managing migration, right? How do you create a migration regime that can manage it? And so actually Trump, a lot of people, Trump's a racist and Trump is deplorable and Trump is xenophobic. And, he look at all of the deportations, if you look at what he's doing, but then actually listen to what he's saying, right? What I'm trying to do, and this was in his first State of the Union address, right? I'm trying to create an immigration model like they have in Canada, right? The AFD says, we need an immigration system like Canada. They quote unquote say it's about merits. You see this language now, right? And you see the coded language, right, of meritocracy, right? We need to end our DEI and we need to go back to a merit-based system, right? And what the merit-based system means in terms of immigration, it means permanent residency and citizenship for people coming from certain countries with certain language skills, with certain skill set, and for everyone coming from the global south, it means low-wage work on closed work permits as temporary migrants that can be disposed of at any time, right? And this is a lot of the border violence that you're seeing in the U.S. because what they're trying to do is re-engineer their system. And this is the same thing that actually happened in Europe. After World War II, most of the capitalist development in Europe and North America took place under guest worker programs, right? So in Germany, it was Turkish migrant workers under the Gastarbeiter program. In France, it was directly from the colonies. In England, it was mostly migrant workers from the Caribbean, but also from India. And in the US, you had the Bracero program. But they realized they couldn't actually get rid of the migrant workers, right? Especially when there was the crisis in 73, they couldn't get rid of the migrant workers and migrant workers were organizing. And so they're like, you know what? We're not going to do temporary migration anymore because it's too complicated. Migrants don't go back. We can't control it. But Canada figured out a mechanism to do that. And so now it becomes the envy of the advanced capitalist world, where it's like, this is the way where you can manage migration. They even have fancy names for it, right? In terms of globalizing our temporary foreign worker program, they call it circular migration, right? So you're not comfortable enough in the country that you have to migrate to, but that you're going to become a citizen or that you're going to stay, because all of the remittances and all of the money that you make needs to go back to the global south to then get funneled back to the global north. So they call it, managed migration or circular migration. But Canada's model of the kafala system is what's being globalized, right? And that's the whole idea in the book, because it's the one country that, has been able to, recently there's been, major critiques, right? Even by the UN Special Rapporteur on modern forms of slavery, who said Canada's temporary foreign worker program is a breeding ground of modern day slavery. But the fact is that it's still one that is an envy. So they're trying to really expand it through the Global Forum on Migration and Development, through the G20, especially Canada's model of, Canada's migration regime.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. You mentioned the different aspects of violence that these temporary workers and immigrant workers sort of face. There was a moment in the book where you mentioned workers from Guatemala who were sitting in a detention center, and they contacted your center after being arrested during a raid on a chicken farm. So the charges that were laid were only on them as being basically undocumented people working on a farm. But were there any charges that were laid on the employers, or there's a story that's being painted here, like the criminality is attributed to the people who are poor, who are trying to work and make a living, but not the actual people who are exploiting them. So what kind of message is being sent here when these charges are being laid specifically on the workers and not the employers?
No, it's extremely clear, right? So this case, it's structural, right? So it's never a bad apple, right? So these group of 16 workers from Guatemala who were working, outside of Sherbrooke, and were working for a very bad employer that they got recruited through. They were then told by this other recruiter, "Come work for me. I'll fix your papers. I'll find you better work," because they were working as chicken catchers. They have to catch, it's something like 10,000 chickens a day, in these industrial, without any protection, right? And without any health and safety. They were making under minimum wage. And so this recruiter said, "Just come work for me. I'll figure it out. I'll get your papers. I'll get everything." So they went with him, believing that this person was going to get them new work permits because they're here on closed work permits, find them better jobs. And then these workers were making well below. These workers were working 80 hours a week and making a little over $200 a week. And they're being told all the money was going to pay for their new work permits. And then they're leaving the farm one day. And then they'd been tracked by the RCMP, by drones, and there was just a major raid. Buses showed up. They were surrounded. They were put on the buses. They were going to be deported that night. And then they had called the Refugee Action Center, and then which called us. And then many of them, they were able to get out of immigration detention. But what happened was the original employer called CBSA, obviously, right? Someone's poaching my workers, right? This is the thing about the program, right? When you think about unfree labor, right? Like their property, right? Like employers really treat people like property, right? So it's like someone stole my workers, right? Like they don't have the choice. Just be like, do you know what? Like everybody else in capitalism, you're free to hire me. I'm free to leave, But literally they were treated like property, right? Like someone stole my property. How dare they leave me, right? And that employer had been fined previously $600, right? There is no there's complete impunity, right? There's a lot of moral outrage, and you constantly get it in the media in Quebec. But in Quebec, UPA is like a cartel, right? Like, I mean, agriculture in Quebec is extremely critical, right? And we have this false image of agriculture in Quebec that's like Madame Monsieur, like very rural, very like just like some organic chicken farm, and people are running in the fields, and there's some kids and a dog or whatever, and it's crap. That's not what it is, right? It's highly centralized, it's highly industrialized, and through a series of subcontractors, right? So UPA is very powerful. FERM is the other agency that recruits these migrant workers, is also very powerful. So they're never they always have a kind of an impunity, and the fines are so small that they just keep getting away with it. And even if you don't get away with it, you close and you open up under a new name, and no one stops you. And so these workers were punished with deportation for breaking the rules of their visa because they were supposed to work for that employer. They believed that they were working legally through another employer who had tricked them, the recruiter. But again, yeah, they were punished. And the employers were not, right? They've symbolically won victories, but they're still having they're still in like legal battles. And some of these workers had to go home. And the problem with this example, as bad as it is actually just like the tip of the eye. It's like, it's structural.
Yeah, no, that story was probably the most shocking one that I was reading. It was disheartening, and it's sad to know that that is the reality on the farms in this country. You briefly mentioned the concept or the act of remittance, and how sort of people from the global south will specifically come to countries like Canada specifically to work, not to necessarily live in the country and be there, but to work and send money back home. And as they do that, it keeps them sort of like in this permanent position of constantly living in poverty because they're sending so much money back. With us knowing that and employers knowing that, how does that sort of like play into that sort of oppression and exploitation that exists with workers? That these employers know that these people are coming here, not necessarily like they're aware, like, okay, I'll get a, temporary work visa, so there's probably no pathway for me to ever get citizenship, but like whatever money I make, the scraps and the bits, that's enough for my family back home to live off of. What do you think about sort of that?
No, employers knowing that even a worker sending $100 or $200 back through Western Union is like a lifeline for these workers' families is an immense amount of power that employers use all of the time, right? You have to accept these conditions. You have to accept what I'm paying you. You have to accept what I'm charging you for the recruitment fees, despite them being illegal. So there's this major power dynamic that's used all the time, knowing that these workers are desperate to send money back home, not just to their families. So a lot of the times workers, to be able to pay those fees, there's an assumption, well, if they paid, $5,000 in recruitment fees, they must be rich, right? What a lot of people do is they have to take loans, they have to sell their land, because in the global south, what do you have? You have land. You don't have anything else. And so people are putting up their land. People are taking out loans. So just to even pay back the recruitment fees. So employers know this too, right? And that people's families are not just desperate for the remittances, but live in fear if their family member can't pay back the recruiter. So a lot of the times, employers are really able to abuse the circumstance, right? And they always, the classic tropes is, you're making 10 times more than what you would make back home. What are you complaining about? Right? So there's this global dimension to it that employers here manipulate in order to control their workers, right? In order to control these migrants and to just hyper exploit them. Because one of the things employers do, you see this especially in the farms, is that the only time that they get off from the farms is that they'll get bussed out, into St. Remy to send remittances. Mm-hmm. Right? So there's even a spectacle of it, right?
Does that affect, like, when you're working, because you're working closely with these people, have any of them been like, I don't, like, I understand that I'm being exploited, I know what's happening, but, like, I can't be involved with mobilizing my workplace because it's going to cost the little that I already have. Like, that must be, like, sort of like a block in sort of the organizing that you engage in.
Of course, right? I mean, a lot of the organizing that ends up happening is, like, usually in the aftermath, right? It's never in the during, right? Unless it's gone too far, right? Employers withhold money, employers aren't paying, and workers are getting fired. But usually in the context where workers are still working, it's very hard to do that mobilizing because of the remittances, because of how little, how much families are so dependent on that money. Because it means it's the school fees, it's the hospital bills, it's everything, right? And so it constantly plays, and workers have to kind of reproduce themselves here, right? So workers have these double lives, right? So they have to send money back home and they have to live here. So of course it takes away their mobilizing. And it takes away their mobilizing if not that they have two jobs and be able to do that, right? I mean, one of the funny things about Amazon, this isn't so much about sort of agricultural workers, is that a lot of them work at like Uber, like after their shift. So no matter how brutal Amazon is, after they're done at Amazon, you just see them like Uber sign after Uber sign after Uber sign, and they're all working even longer, despite the brutality of working at Amazon 10 hours a day, because their families are dependent on them. So, of course, it really inhibits the mobilizing and the organizing for many migrant workers.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Touching on Amazon, so like aspects like delivery, transportation, logistics as a whole has been like kind of a big part of like neoliberal economies in the West. We've seen it clearly with Amazon and how like big sort of company conglomerates can completely pull out when with any kind of threat of like unions and stuff, without it impacting their profits. Can you sort of explain the specific situation with Amazon, what it reveals about the relationship between like big companies, the West, and like precarious workers, and what kind of relationship is happening there?
Well, I mean, Amazon is like a prime example of like the contemporary capitalism, right? And sort of a global capitalism that really is premised on not the production of things, of goods, but actually on the circulation of them, right? Because most of the manufacturing now just happens in the global South. So for capitalist companies here, all they really do is move goods, right? And it's not just Amazon, right? So every company you can think of that every shop you go to is in one form or another in the business of logistics, right? Walmart is a logistics company. Metro is a logistics company. It buys things, transports them, and then sells them. It circulates.
You're talking about the grocery store.
Yes,
Okay.
The grocery store, right? Where the capitalism in the industrialized countries are based on now on the circulation of goods and consumption, right? And how do you then compete, right? And so we'll talk about this, and you know, and there's a Marxist economist who discusses this idea of time-based competition, right? And that capitalist firms essentially are just based, the way they compete is to collapse time, right? So the faster we deliver things is what's fundamental to extracting surplus, or what is actually going to make you profitable, right? And you see this in all elements of the economy, right? So you see this in the development of e-commerce, and you see this with Amazon. You see this even in like sort of the Uber economy or the gig economy. All of it is about collapsing time and space, right? All of it is about moving goods as fast as possible and as cheap as possible, right? And Amazon really is sort of this, you know, a lot of people think Jeff Bezos is really brilliant. You know, like, you know, look at how capitalism, it gives these, you know, the entrepreneurial spirits or whatever. And actually, Jeff Bezos is sort of this, like the Frankenstein birth child of globalization, right? So Amazon starts in 1994, right? You have two things happening at once, right? You have globalized production, you know, the Walmart model. You have the birth of the internet at the same time, because of all of those profits from destroying unions, from austerity, from just-in-time production, so all of these profits have nowhere to go. Where does it go? It goes right back into the internet, right? All of these venture funds and whatnot in Silicon Valley. And that what really gives birth to Amazon, right? And Amazon's growth really was this idea that you can, you know, that logistics had become a central part of capitalism, right? And to manage logistics in a way that could offer fast, quote unquote, fast and free shipping had become central. And so over time, Amazon, you know, one of the things, you know, Amazon didn't care about was profitability, right? It just wanted to dominate markets, right? And that profitability became later. And I think it's really important when you think about what happened in Amazon in Quebec, right? Was that their idea of how you dominate markets was that you need to crush the competition, right? And that they had learned particular skills in their early days. You know, how do you squeeze out book publishers, right?
That's what it originally was. Like, it was like a place that was for people to buy books.
Books.
Okay.
Right? And the reason why he picked books, because there were so many, no one bookstore actually had that many books that existed out in the world. But then if you created an online store, then people would have access, and that they were easy to store as well. It was cheap to warehouse books. And then what did he do? He squeezed out actual bookstores by making books cheaper. So once they had a monopoly, they were able to tell publishers, you know, you're going to give us these books at this price. And then they would go around and sell it cheaper. And then actual bookstores were screwed because they actually were selling books more expensive than Amazon, right? And so that's really been Amazon's model since its inception, right? And now, I mean, its expansion is to the point where Amazon now is the second largest employer on earth, private employer, only behind Walmart, right? And Amazon, even though it claims it's really this sort of this digital Silicon Valley company, is simply the largest logistics company on earth, right? It owns its own ships. It builds its own containers. It has its own airports. Um, it employs 1.6 million people globally. 1.6 million people globally outside of all of the subcontractors. And dominates 50% of all online retail, right? I mean, the market capitalization of Amazon is something like, it would make it a G20 country at this point, right? And that's one firm, right? And so they're able to really and they've manipulated digital technology in a way to be able to control workers and to be able to create this new form of Taylorism, right? This sort of the digital Taylorism. I mean, it's a very academic term, but like in the ways that it's transformed work, right? And I mean, as the second largest employer on earth, it has a massive ripple effect, right? And I think people really misunderstand, when people think about bad work conditions and they talk about Amazon or they think about Amazon, people, high rates of injury, people peeing in the bottle in the US. And a lot of this digital control makes workers completely replaceable, right? So all of the digital technology that gets used, it's not to replace human beings. It's never to replace human labor, because humans are still cheaper than robots. So the idea is that you can mesh technology with humans to make humans work faster and harder, and then also just be rendered disposable. And then you can insert a new human in that technology at the same time, right? And that is Amazon's I guess innovation into the world, and it has like a massive ripple effect, because all these other capitalists, I want to be like Amazon, right? I want to be as rich as Jeff Bezos, right? We're going to deliver as quick as Amazon does, or we're going to be able to reach the level of efficiency that Amazon does, but Amazon has cornered the market on a lot of these technologies. So what Amazon does is it becomes the infrastructure of the market. So you can't compete with Amazon, but you can rent out their management system, right? So you can rent out the algorithms that control the AI cameras inside the warehouse. You can rent out the metric systems that gauge what workers are doing or what they're not doing. And that level of minute control, even though there's a level of workers, senses a level of neutrality in it, it's actually about a high sense of control. And that's why Amazon is so anti-union, right? In Quebec or anywhere around the world. It has nothing to do with money. Amazon, I mean, is a $2 trillion company, right? Like money has never been the question, right? It's about control. And if there's a union, that means workers will have some degree of control over the pace of work, over sort of the technologies used in work, and how work is actually managed. Because there is no management inside Amazon. It's mostly an automated management system, right? And so it would go at the core of Amazon's model. And that's why they're so adamant about not having any union. And I think also why, when Amazon made the decision in January to close all of the warehouses in retaliation of the unionization, that they were going to use this as like as a little laboratory, right? Like, here is going to be this experiment where can we actually just control the digital technology and then have a subcontractor just provide the human labor and the physical infrastructure, and just worsen the labor conditions, but do the exact same thing as if we had direct control, right? And Because if then they can do that, they can actually then replicate that in other places. And then they'll never have to worry about a union ever again. Right? Because what's important for them is if it's the digital technology that is the conveyor belt, right? Similar to that of Fordism. And I mean, I think at some point, I mean, the turnover rate is too high that they're actually going to have a labor problem. But at this moment, they feel that they actually don't, right? Because, I mean, it's, and you can imagine the US is kind of like this company country for Amazon, right? Like 1 out of 30 Americans have either worked or work for Amazon, right? And so when Amazon, and you had this pressure of beginning of strikes in December in the United States. So they used Quebec really as this sort of this testing ground, right? In a way, what happened in Quebec is so important. People, I think, will underestimate sort of how important it actually was. So, in terms of this moment of trying to challenge precarious labor and Amazon's labor model and organizing from below, Amazon pulled, I don't like using the analogy, but I can't find another one. It's like Chile in 1973, right? It's like New York in 1975, right? When you think about these moments when the world changed, right? Like when neoliberalism, sort of this kind of shock doctrine, right? So like the financial crisis in New York City, where all the bankers and all the investment funds walked away from the city and said, we're not going to pay the debt anymore, screw you. And then they had to go into this massive crisis, or the coup, the US backed coup against Allende, or, Margaret Thatcher or Ronald Reagan. It's like that. It's this moment, right? Like workers, you're going to challenge Amazon and you're going to challenge the model of labor. Well, do you know what? We're just going to end the whole thing, right? And we're going to send a signal to everyone, whoever wants to organize against us, that it's never going to happen. And I think, and 2 days after Jeff Bezos is standing behind Donald Trump, it sort of marks this kind of the moment we're in.
Yeah, it's sending an eerie, warning.
Yes.
So, so far the discussion has been amazing, and I've been enjoying it. I'm gonna close off with one last question, and then
okay, I think people are getting sleepy, but
no. Okay, so you referred to a few examples in the book of moments of success among migrant workers who are able to successfully organize their workplace, meet the demands that they were advocating for. But from that, it seems as though it's kind of slightly bypassing the concept of the big union and everyone sort of being under this massive union that represents all, somewhat of what the CSN strategy is a bit. Tell us a bit about how they did that, and how does it kind of go against what against sort of the big union that represents all the interest of the workers. And because I think sometimes when people talk about the union, it's in that context, but some of the examples in the book kind of just go a little bit against that. I don't know if you want to sort of.
No, I mean, all of the examples, I mean, I think in the book, I mean, there are a few examples maybe out of Europe where there's these attempts at building relationships or trying to build within the bigger institutional unions. But a lot of them are either sort of worker center approaches, kind of like the Immigrant Workers Center, which is about trying to build a space for workers to come together to build a sense of solidarity, and really a space to figure out what their needs are and their campaigns, and their demands, right? So we're thinking about trying to really undermine or build a movement against the sort of the pillars of what keeps people precarious, right? Whether it be their immigration status, right? Whether it be the entire closed work permit regime, whether it be around being, temp agency workers or being misclassified. All of these things need to be fought, before kind of rebuilding any kind of labor movement, right? In a serious way. because employers will just have new tricks up their sleeves, right? And then unions are going to get frustrated, right? And so to us, like at the Immigrant Workers Center, our approach is really to organize workers where they are, right? In their community, in the workplace, because we just have to do the organizing, right? We have to build the trust. We have to build the relationships. When a lot of people go back historically and they say this and they'll hold up things as these models, right? And they hold them up as, unfortunately, as moments that are sort of these trans-historical, a lot of people who want to go to this big union, they'll say, well, look back at the CIO, look back at what happened, or look back at 1972 in Quebec, or look back at the 1930s auto strikes, and look back at these moments. But something had to arrive to get to that moment, right? And so if you look back, even at the labor movement in North America, it was mostly attempts at rank and file immigrant labor organizing of small independent unions or organizations that led that, right? It was the temples of labor, it was the knights of labor that led to the CIO, right? That led to the IWW, right? And even the IWW in its heyday was always open and experimenting, right? So if you look at how the IWW was organizing in the West Coast, I kind of get really excited by the example. It could be depressing or exciting because you feels like some things actually haven't changed, but at the same time, the feel that people were trying it 100 years ago, in the West Coast, it was these anarchists that were working with Punjabi speaking farm workers from Vancouver to California, right? And doing schools and having worker centers and kind of having that approach that was like, no, we really have to be grounded in these working class communities and build that trust and build that relationship before you're really going to have any sense of class consciousness where people are going to want to fight and organize and build unions, right? Because the conception of unions now, unfortunately, for a lot of people, it's like an insurance company, right? It's not an organism of collective self-defense. That's not how people view it, right? And so I think, our task and our job now, and I see the Workers Center as being part of that tradition, is like we're actually building relationships and trying to build struggle with these immigrant and migrant workers or communities or neighborhoods that could then lead to building unions or building new forms of organization, right? But to be wedded to it's, a tactic, and that's what it is. A union is a tactic. I think you begin to lose the possibility of other forms of struggle, right? So, going back to Amazon here, for example. Okay, Amazon gets up and leaves, right? You had a union. You had attempts at unions. You put in all of these resources. And then you try to build the leadership of these workers. But because they no longer work at Amazon and pay dues, they're just not necessary. But because unions think as unions, not as a working class organization, then you lose those people. But we're like a working class organization. So it's like, you don't want those Amazon workers? Fine, we'll work with them. We'll organize with them. They want to be involved in something. They want to fight, right? We're horrible at recruiting people at any level. So if there's a group of workers that want to be involved in a struggle, why are you going to abandon them because they can't actually pay dues and give you a certified bargaining unit? That makes no sense. We're not at that stage, right? And so to me, worker centers, I think are, there's limits also. People will say, well, there's critiques, and it's true, there are limits to what you can do because you can't build unions or we're not going to be a union, right? So people say, well, it's the services and it's agency. But at the same time, we've built a space of solidarity where we've built people's leadership. We've brought together different communities of migrant and immigrant workers who are organizing. And it's not, it's almost like a proto union or a hybrid union, right? And, the other examples in the book that, you can't extract all of the lessons from, right? So in Italy, you had, unions like CCOBAS. CCOBAS is an extremely militant radical union. They're predominantly migrant workers in the logistics sector. You can go on strike. You don't have to. It's not limited by the law here. They've reached to 20,000 members. Some of their main organizers are migrant workers themselves, and no institutional union wanted them. And they've raised the conditions of logistics workers in a way that I've never seen in my life, right? And they're completely democratic. They work on assembly model. It's non-bureaucratic and it's highly militant, right? You had the attempts to organize delivery drivers and gig workers in London through the Independent Great Britain Workers Union. And they don't have a clear ideology. They're not IWW, or they also came out of LAWAS, the Latin American Workers Association, and they formed an independent union. They tried with the institutional union, but they didn't want to organize in a way that made sense to their members, right? And so they became an independent union, and they've grown into the thousands, right? So you have all of these experiments that are taking place that point to the possibility that you can have these rank and file, militant, democratic unions that are based in these communities and these populations that are effective, right? And, maybe at some point, do they become part of these larger unions? So one example I give is the Taxi Workers Alliance in New York, right? They have 20,000 members. They had 2 general strikes. They shut down New York City twice. They had a political strike during Trump where they shut down JFK Airport. But they're part of the AFL-CIO, right? They've also joined the New York Labor Council Federation, right? So they're part of the broader labor movement and not outside of it, but they've also remained independent. And maybe there is going to be a model where we have to think about hybrid ways, right? Why, if I was CSN going back to Amazon, I would have a section of, unemployed Amazon workers, right? Forget it being DXD4, but like of all Amazon workers, right? This is an opportunity to say, hey, you know what? We're serious about this. Let's have a section for all of you laid off Amazon workers because you're still fighting for severance. And we were the ones who tried to unionize you in the first place, right? Here's a clear example. Or we'll have, it's really difficult to organize migrant farm workers, but we'll have a migrant farm workers association, right? And we'll have a sectoral approach, right? But for them, there's always going to be, and I think for the big unions, a cost benefit analysis. That's the fundamental problem, right? As opposed to a strategic analysis says, do you know what? If lots of people became involved and we supported them, they're going to become members and they're going to say, do you know what? My life is better. My work conditions are better because I'm part of this bigger organization where there is a sense of solidarity and common struggle, right? But there's not that long-term sort of strategic thinking. So that kind of approach will never flourish.
I think that's all the questions that I have. I don't know if you want to open it up to questions for folks in here, or.
Is there stuff that you wanted to say?
Yeah. Or things that people in the future can sort of look out for, if people can sort of come by, if there's people who are watching who have cases themselves, could come by to the, if that's something that'd be.
I mean, there are a few, a few, like, I guess, I think now one thing to add, especially in the current moment, is that we placating to like the far right and placating to sort of xenophobia and racism is not going to bring back some kind of class struggle that you imagine, right? That like this is not what's going to happen in this moment, right? It's only going to further embolden the far right, and that nationalism has clearly shown that it has one interest and one interest only, right? It's that of the oligarchs, right? That is clear, right? Like we saw that on January the 20th, and we see that here, that their interests are protecting capital and not workers. So trying to play catch up to that isn't actually going to help bring back working class people, but actually a sense of solidarity, a sense of trying to forge a new kind of common sense of struggle between migrants and other workers, and trying to figure out how to weave all of those struggles together is actually what's going to rebuild our movements. And I think that's really critical, because I think we're going to reach that that juncture, I think, very very soon, and we're already there, right? And that this idea that you can throw anyone under the bus it's not helping our movements, it's actually undermining them. And so I think it's really important, and like in our current moment, and that's we just have to be more imaginative about how we think about class and how we think about those struggles and migration and how we weave them together. And I think what does that mean? It means, I think, and what we need to think about in the near future is then how do we undermine the far right with this, right? How do we build that kind of solidarity in the future, right? We don't step back from our ideas and our vision, but like we go forward. Why isn't there freedom of movement for people but not capital, right? Why we shouldn't be defending the free trade of goods, but we can't defend the freedom of movement of people, right? We should be doing the opposite, right? We should say, yeah, we're anti-capitalist. These free trade agreements and these things shouldn't actually be defended, because all they do is support employers, not workers. And if workers had the ability to have their sense of freedom and not be super exploited, actually is going to take away from your job, or is going to take away from your living crisis, but actually will give the most marginalized workers a sense of power to organize, or to like lift up the bottom, right? And I think the priority now is to build a sense of solidarity and between migrants and unions between migrants and other communities, and because that's going to be our way. That's how we're actually going to resist in this moment, right? And so that status for all is a working class issue, right? And that also working class campaigns are also migrant issues, right? It's a two-way street. And I think for people that do want to be involved, those organizations are still existing, right? So the Immigrant Workers Center or Solidarity Across Borders, that there is a vibrant migrant justice movement, in Quebec that's actually trying to challenge this.
Yep. Thank you so much, Mustafa, for sitting down with us. you've given us such like a really big insight on some of the things both you said today and in the book as well. I think the book is super important read just because it is very specific to the stuff that's happening both in Quebec and in Canada. So I just also want to thank you for writing the book. I think it opened sort of my eyes to what was going. Like I obviously knew about like the exploitations, but the actual sort of specific nature to it, and the complicity of like both the people in government and power, even my own complicity, brought like yeah. So thank you so much, and yeah.
Thank you so much.